So let's get into JavaScript's history before we start learning about the language itself, because it's kind of important to understand where JavaScript came from and how we got to be where we are now in order to use JavaScript effectively. JavaScript, unlike many languages, has had a lot of different applications and started in sort of an odd way as an imperative, not so much as something that someone was experimenting with to try to launch a new language to solve new problems. So let's kind of start from the early days of the web, which was probably the Mosaic Web Browser, which was the first real practical modern browser. And the Mosaic Web Browser provided some interesting capabilities that weren't really very common at the time. One of those was that it actually interpreted HTML, which was kind of novel back in 1993. And it also allowed you to display graphics, and you can see some very basic HTML in this particular page, but even the UI itself is pretty dated. You've got a lot of information here that's probably not editable, like you can't change the document title. And the web was really based on text and links at that point. Most of the pages in the early 90s were similar to this. But the web browser, the Mosaic Web Browser, did allow you to kind of navigate effectively in ways that were a little bit more less fragmented than other browsers that were offered at the time. Now, the next sort of update to browser technology was Mosaic Netscape, and you can see the UI is a little bit cleaner here. And Mosaic Netscape was actually the browser that was released prior to the formation of the Netscape Communications Corporation. So there was Mosaic, and then you had Netscape Navigator, but in between you had this one stop where there was Mosaic Netscape. And Netscape Navigator was kind of the big browser from the mid-90s on. Until Internet Explorer came out and started some competition. But Mosaic Netscape did add some basic UI capabilities. Then the idea of interaction with the browser became interesting and intriguing and something that people started to pursue in around 1995. And in 1995, the actual first approach to this was Scheme. They wanted to embed a Scheme scripting language into the Netscape Navigator browser. And the Netscape Communications Corporation actually hired a guy named Brendan Eich, who was brought in to basically figure out a way to make the browser a little bit more interactive by embedding the Scheme language. And around the same time, Sun Microsystems was trying to build Java support into the Netscape browser. So there was a lot of attempts to try to make the browser more interactive. Now, back in 1995, we did actually have Java plugins for the browser, but the computational power wasn't necessarily there. So a lot of times when Java started in your browser, it just crashed or locked up. It wasn't the best experience. So the idea that you needed something a little lighter weight kind of became pretty important and pretty critical moving into the middle of the 90s. Now, this is where things started to heat up around 1995. Microsoft was building its own browser called Internet Explorer, which you'll probably find lots of information about that if you search for it. And Microsoft wanted to embed VBScript as the language for sort of allowing this interactivity in the browser. And so the pressure kind of turned up on Netscape at this point. And the idea was, well, we need to build something that is a little bit more, a little bit more capable that we have control over. And that's where we got to JavaScript. And JavaScript, I think that a lot of people believe that it was called JavaScript as a marketing ploy more than anything. The idea behind JavaScript is that Java was very popular in the mid-90s. It was seen as sort of the thing that was going to power the web. So the idea behind JavaScript was, well, let's call this new language that's running in the browser JavaScript, because it can kind of piggyback on that popularity. So JavaScript is kind of like Java. The syntax is kind of similar. It's got some differences, and some of the underlying ways it operates is pretty different from what you might see in Java. The best description I've ever heard is JavaScript is to Java as sand is to sandwich, and I think that kind of describes it well. It's like it has the name, but similarities start to really break down once you get past the name and some of the basic syntax. Now, JavaScript was used in a couple of different ways. You had JavaScript running in the browser in a basic form to start off, and you had server-side JavaScript very early on in the Netscape Enterprise server. That's not the Nintendo Entertainment server or Nintendo Entertainment System, not that NES. It's a different NES. Netscape Enterprise server allowed you to do some basic server-side scripting with JavaScript. And the other interesting thing about JavaScript in 1995 was that it was built out of a 10-day prototype. This is sort of the industry understanding, was that it was put together quickly so that Netscape could have a scripting language in its browser and sort of beat Microsoft to the market with that capability. But it introduced a lot of confusion because around this time web development was really unfolding rapidly, and there were a lot of different approaches to doing it. So after this whole development of scripting languages, things became pretty de-standardized. And what ended up happening in the mid-90s, once Netscape was out and Internet Explorer was out, and there were a few other minor browsers that were also out, is that they'd add new features. They'd add features to HTML, they'd add CSS, they'd take different interpretations of CSS, they'd implement slightly different versions of JavaScript. And what ended up happening is that sites would be optimized for particular use cases. You would often see these little icons that said this site is best viewed with Netscape Navigator, or this site is best viewed with Internet Explorer, and that got even more confused as time went on and new browsers were released. Because each browser interpreted HTML, CSS, and JavaScript a little bit differently, what you ended up doing was either focusing on one particular browser implementation and version, or you might have to implement a lot of extra code to check to see which version of the browser you were operating in, and then run different JavaScript code based on that detection. And this got very complicated in a lot of interesting ways. Sometimes even from one version of a browser to the next version of the browser, you might have very different behavior. And so web development kind of became an effort to do something interesting and then spend about 3 or 4 times that much time trying to make that interesting thing happen consistently across all of the browsers that someone might use. And things kept getting worse and worse for a couple of years. So after 96, there were more and more browsers coming out, and again, each one of them was doing things slightly differently. So, over the next couple of years, you had new implementations and new ways to approach JavaScript and HTML and CSS. So the idea was that one of these browsers would implement something like a blink tag, and then the other browsers would say, well, that's something we should have. So they'd implement it, but they might not implement it in the exact same way. And I think that one example of this was rounded corners in tables. Trying to create a table with a rounded border kind of caused a lot of different approaches and a lot of complexity in how that might work, to the point where a lot of times people would just create images of rounded corners and embed those in the table as an additional set of cells. And that became a lot of overhead to do some pretty basic things. So over the next 10 years, this sort of escalation and further and further and further departure to try to create interesting new features that were an edge against these other browsers, that was kind of the norm over a while in web development. So it was kind of parallel, because one browser would offer a feature and then the other browsers would all try to catch up with it. So it was parallel but competitive development, all in the name of innovation, which, that innovation might have made the features interesting, but it definitely made the work of developers very complex. And then, outside of this sort of browser interactivity, Ajax, which is asynchronous JavaScript and XML, was started to take hold in 2005, and that made it even worse, because now, in addition to how things were visualized in a browser, you had to think about how communication was working through browsers, and this departure really made things a challenge as browsers and as the web became more and more popular. We're going to look at something like Ajax. Ajax was originally designed with XML, but typically nobody really uses XML anymore. We're going to look at communicating JSON, which is a JavaScript format for representing data. It stands for JavaScript Object Notation. We're going to look at that because it's a little bit more condensed than XML, and it's a little bit easier to follow, I think. It's a little easier to read. But we're now kind of in a phase of web development where we're looking more at a REST approach, which is similar to Ajax, but probably takes it a little bit further and is more of an architectural approach than just a simple way to handle things in the browser. So over the next few years in the history of the web, things started to become a little bit more consistent. So believe it or not, 2009 was finally the point where there was a foundation that agreed on how ECMAScript should work. Like, what is the specification of this JavaScript language? How should it operate? So it was created in 95, and then 14 years later, we had an agreement of how that language should actually operate. And I think the next step that sort of made this a little bit more palatable as far as cross-browser implementation is the HTML5 agreement. So HTML5 was the first time where there was a consistent set of HTML controls and elements that was approved and sort of consistently implemented across browsers. And then a couple of years after that, as sites started to be redeveloped, as new software was built, as new sites were built, things started to normalize a little bit. And this is an interesting problem, that you don't see as much nowadays because people keep things much more up to date. There are automatic updates and things like this. But in the 2000s, you might be dealing with browsers that were 5, 6, 7, 8, sometimes 10 years old. You might be dealing with operating systems that no longer had support. So the need to kind of keep things backwards compatible was very challenging because it took a long time to get out of this space. So you figure even if the browsers that people are using are consistent by 2012, you still have to maintain some level of backwards compatibility for the people who are not updating their browsers and not keeping things up to date over the last few years. So it actually took a long time to get to this point where things almost completely work in a cross-browser fashion. And it's still sometimes a good idea to kind of accommodate some of the older browsers. So the thing about all of this is that I think that a lot of developers believe that JavaScript is an imperfect language. It definitely has some issues and problems, and there have been a lot of attempts to improve that over the years. There have been languages like CoffeeScript and TypeScript, which TypeScript has taken some hold, but JavaScript is still a lot more popular than TypeScript. And the reason for this is because there is so much JavaScript running in the world right now. Every browser-based application, so every web application out there, has some amount of JavaScript in it, and that's running for websites from everything from managing employee days off and time off, all the way to very straightforward social media sites. JavaScript is everywhere, and I think that because of that, it's very difficult to change it. JavaScript is supported in all of the major browsers today, and because JavaScript is out there and it's so pervasive, it's very difficult to change much fundamentally. You can't deprecate features in JavaScript very quickly because you might break a significant portion of the internet. You can't necessarily introduce a new language because there's so much prior art and so much already written in JavaScript that moving to a new language would require the major browser providers now to all get on board with a new language, provide native support for that language, and then be able to effectively interpret that the same way that they've implemented over 20 years of support for JavaScript. So the thing is that the genie is out of the bottle. I think it's difficult to put the genie back into the bottle in this situation. JavaScript is probably not going to change dramatically over the next couple of years. It is what it is, and we will work with it the best that we can. But you'll see it points throughout the rest of the class where you have to accommodate or you have to think about something in the way that it was done in the past. And there are even some instances where some things are not going to work quite perfectly or quite as you might expect across browsers. So we'll point those out when we come to them. But hopefully this bit of JavaScript history will give you some good context for approaching the language in the next few lectures. Thank you for watching.